Hello there, welcome to Lena's Lane, and in this episode of Case Files, I'll be sharing with you the case of Frazier Baker, so make sure you stay tuned for more. After the presidential election in 1896, William McKinley's administration appointed hundreds of blacks to postmasterships across the southern United States during his remaining tenure, as part of patronage jobs to build local networks. Local whites resented any black Republican office holders. They claimed to fear that the increased political power of black postmasters would embolden them to proposition white women. Frazier Baker, who was born in 1855 in Effingham, South Carolina, a primarily black area, was a 40-year-old married, father of 6 school teacher and former farmer and treasurer of the Colored Farmers Alliance in Florence County, South Carolina. He became a postmaster of the Effingham Post Office in that county on March 15, 1892. He held this position at least until November 1894. Records show that he became postmaster at Lake City in Williamsburg County, South Carolina, which is primarily white, on July 30, 1897. Upon the recommendation of Edmund H. Dees, a Republican African-American deputy collector of Internal Revenue. The white residents of Lake City filed several grievances against Baker, criticizing his administrative abilities and accusing him of being incompetent, ill-mannered, and lazy. They initiated a boycott of the Lake City post office and circulated petitions calling for Mr. Baker's dismissal. They complained that he had cut mail delivery from 3 times a day to 1 after the threats against his life were made. A postal inspector arrived to investigate the complaints and recommended that the post office closes. In response to the recommendation, a white mob attempted to shoot both Mr. Baker and his assistant numerous times, and resorted to burning down the post office where he was residing, with the expectation that no one would rent out space for use as a post office while Mr. Baker remained postmaster. The government obtained property on the outskirts of town, a former schoolhouse that had been converted into a residential dwelling and post office. Although threats kept occurring, in early February 1898, Mr. Baker felt safe enough to send for his family, which included his wife, 37-year-old Lavinia Baker, their oldest daughter Rosa, who was 18 years old, 14-year-old daughter Cora, 11-year-old son Lincoln, 7-year-old daughter Sarah, 5-year-old son William, and their baby girl Julia, who was only a 1-year-old. 13 days after arriving to Lake City, on February 22, 1898, at 1 a.m., the Baker family awoke to their house, which also served as the post office, on fire. Mr. Baker attempted to put out the fire by throwing buckets of water on the flames. He called to his daughter Rosa to help assist him in putting out the fire, but they were unsuccessful. As the smoke thickened that night, the mob outside started to open fire. Mr. Baker sent his oldest son Lincoln to get help. When Lincoln opened the front door, he called out, "I'm shot. I can't call anymore." Mr. Baker cursed the mob and began to pray. As the flames grew and the heat intensified, Baker turned to his wife, who he noticed was in a state of shock and could not move. He grabbed her, saying, "Come on, we might as well die running as standing." Mr. Baker headed to the door. Before he could open it, a bullet struck and unalived his 1-year-old daughter Julia, who Mrs. Baker was holding. Mrs. Baker was shot with the bullet that passed through Julia's body into her own wrist, which caused her to drop her baby. She shouted, "See, baby's dead." Mr. Baker stepped back and saw his baby daughter lying lifeless. Realizing that his youngest daughter had been unalived, Mr. Baker threw open the door with his wife following behind him and was shot several times, causing him to collapse into his wife's lap. With her husband and baby daughter shot dead and lying at her feet and wounded herself, Mrs. Baker knew the only way out of the burning house was out the front door and into the hail of the angry mob's bullets. Mrs. Baker managed to make it to the front door, but was struck in the leg by a second bullet and fell down beside the burning building. She yelled out to her children to run. They managed to escape through an open back door and ran from the building into a field across the road and hid among the shrubs. The frightened and wounded family stayed hidden in the field until the fire subsided. The mob dispersed quickly as they rode into town. Both Mr. Baker and his baby daughter, Julia, lie dead on the floor of their home while flames consumed their bodies. Their remains were burnt beyond recognition. The local white newspaper insensitively reported that they had been cremated in the flames. Mrs. Baker made her way to a neighbor's home, where she found Cora there waiting. They were later joined by Rosa, who fled the house as an armed white male pursued her. Mrs. Baker was shot in her wrist and leg. Rosa was shot in her arm, which ended up broken. Cora was shot in her right hand, and Lincoln was shot in his abdomen and also suffered a broken arm. Fortunately, Sarah and William escaped unharmed. Mrs. Baker would later testify that they did not receive medical care until a month later when they were taken to the Charleston Colored Hospital to be treated under the care of Dr. Alonzo McLennan for 2 months on March 24th. After recuperating from her injuries and tending to her 3 other critically injured children, Mrs. Baker remained in Charleston with her family for 16 more months. During that time, she received assistance from anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells. Wells was known as the mother of the anti-lynching movement. The lynching of Frazier and Julia Baker outraged her. Determined to help the Baker family, she wrote letters to the Department of Justice and to the former Republican Senator Henry Dawes to urge the president for medical and financial aid for the surviving Baker family, noting that the family was now in the Black Hospital in Charleston. And when they recover, they have no funds to buy food, shelter, or clothing. Although she succeeded, the Bakers never received any money because the government's attention was distracted by another national crisis, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Her frustrations is expressed in her book on lynching in the U.S., and I quote, "Here again was an illustration of how our own people seem to stand in the way of any accomplishment of federal intervention against lynching." On May 2, 1898, a mass meeting was held at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, which passed a resolution condemning the attack. The congregation collected $16, which would have been $460 in today's dollar, for the Baker family. As for the perpetrators, the state did not press charges. However, President McKinley ordered a federal investigation that resulted in the prosecution of 13 white men, 2 of whom offered to testify in return for protection and not to be prosecuted, which were Joseph Newham and Early Lee. The white men were indicted on charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, and destruction of mail. The trial started on April 10, 1899, in the Federal District Court of Charleston, South Carolina. The defendants included Alonzo Rogers, Charles Joyner, Edwin Rogers, Ezra McKnight, Henry Godwin, Henry Stokes, Marion Clark, Martin Ward, Oscar Kelly, W.A. Webster, and Moultrie Epps. The all-white jury was composed of businessmen from across the state. Newham, the prosecution's star witness, testified to starting the fire and identified 8 of the defendants as having participated in the murders. He expressed no remorse for the death of Mr. Baker and his daughter. Another witness, M.B. Springs, identified Henry Stokes as the ringleader. Springs was ostracized in Lake City and was ultimately placed under police protection. Henderson Williams, an African-American witness, testified that he had seen armed white men at the post office on the night of the lynching. He was threatened and fled to Florence after a white business partner threatened to, and I quote, do him like they did Baker. And after 22 hours of deliberation, 3 of the men were found not guilty. But despite ample evidence, the all-white jury remained deadlocked on a verdict for the other 8. The judge declared a mistrial, and the federal prosecutors did not reopen the case. After the trial, Mrs. Baker moved her family to Boston, Massachusetts, at the urging of a young white activist reformer, Lillian Jewett. Jewett took a personal interest and saw it as an opportunity to arouse recognition for her campaign. She appealed to the members of a prominent African American church in Boston to help lead her effort to rescue the Bakers, who were reportedly in need of money. She wanted to bring the family to Boston. She faced backlash from the city's black elite and from the Colored National League, who had already been working on the matter. They felt the league should handle any plans for the Bakers, not turn it over to, and I quote, some chit of a white girl who sprang up overnight. Ignoring the passionate debate, Jewett secretly traveled to Charleston, where she convinced Miss Baker to return to Boston, promising to provide for the family. For nearly 2 years under Jewett's guidance, or some would say exploitation, Mrs. Baker and her family were paraded in front of audiences, revealing their injuries to horrified gasps as they living against the horrors of lynching. An abolitionist, William Garrison II, raised $1,200 to provide a home for the Bakers in Boston. Over the next few years, a tuberculosis outbreak ravaged through a poor black community in Boston, affecting the Baker family, which claimed the lives of 4 of the Baker's children, which were William, whose teenage occupation was listed as an errand boy. William died in 1908 at the age of 15. Sarah's occupation is listed as houseworker. She was admitted to a Worcester State Asylum. She unfortunately ended her life there while suffering from tuberculosis in 1909. She was 19 years old. As an adult, Lincoln worked as a laborer. He died in 1916 from tuberculosis. He was 29 years old. And Cora's occupation was a housemaid. She died March 9, 1920 from tuberculosis. She was 36 years old. Rosa, the firstborn, became a music teacher. She died in 1942 from a heart attack. She was 62 years old. And in 1942, after her last child died, Mrs. Baker returned to Florence County, South Carolina, less than 5 miles from Lake City, where she remained until her death. Miss Lavinia Baker died September 6, 1947. She was 86 years old and buried in Dickfield Cemetery in Cartersville, South Carolina. And in 2003, the State General Assembly passed a resolution in favor of installing a South Carolina historical marker about the lynching and house fire. That marker was unveiled in October 2013 on South Church Street, the previous location of the post office in Baker's home. And in 2019, the Lake City Post Office was renamed to honor Frazier Baker, the facility of the United States Postal Service located at 226 West Main Street in Lake City, South Carolina, as the Postmaster Frazier B. Baker Post Office. That was the case of Frazier Baker. Down in the comments section, let us know whether or not you heard of this case. What were your thoughts? Let's talk about it. And thanks for watching. Bye for now.